Hello everyone. A reflection, completely, I mean, not completely extemporary, but still, nobody asked me, but it's something that, buzzes in my mind every once in a while. You have to think, you know, what, there is this uh, routine, this schedule that I have about the videos and picking the topics and making it, mostly the historical ones, right? And I like doing that. But it also takes time, and it's important to do it well with the right mood and preparation. But then there is also this um, thinking behind that goes beyond, in fact, that aspect. I told you many times how I think that after all, the value of what we do here stands in the way we frame knowledge, not much just about knowledge in itself. Of course, you can't have anything like a frame if you don't have knowledge either, right? But after this point, sometimes I compensate at least for the fact that we don't make phone closet videos anymore to bring, but we'll finish it as soon as I fix most of the things, or with the re-uploads and all this stuff. But it's important to have this other moment of reflection, a theoretical one that it's important to stress. It's not abstract, right? It is concrete because again, it does stem from practice, from knowledge in itself, right? And this is a bit of an issue in itself because you know what this channel is about, but you don't know how this reflects on even my interpersonal relations to people. They used to say most of the times I come across somebody, it's not that I start talking about military history. I try to always make it, as if I were not obsessed by it. And frankly, I'm not, right? In my life, this is kind of my job, but and I love it, but like I don't bug people all the time with that, and even the people who live the closest to me can assure you that, first of all, they kind of like themselves, so maybe they're not the best example I would pick in that sense. But what this reflects actually in is the broader vision, right? And what it means to make. And to many, I'm a wordsmith or a word maker rather, and for not saying words in the sense that somebody who studies and talks but doesn't do much apparently. That's an idea I would like to counter in a way, not just because it's about me. And I must confess to this, that I do start realizing that, of course, practical experience, direct exposure, right, to things I talk about is what I'm tremendously lacking. Like, especially in the last year, which is kind of normal because fortunately I don't have to go in a freaking war to find that out. I confess that when I was younger, when there was the mess in Ukraine, I would have liked to go there, literally, like a contractor or something, even though I had no training, nothing whatsoever. So it would have taken away, I would have, my family would have died probably by knowing that. It would have, thrown away at least months of my life. It would have, maybe even gotten killed or maimed or something like that. But I would have not done it, let's be honest. But let's say in the last year, I got reacquainted to the in the hard way, by the way, in a way that I would have not liked to do for different reasons now I can digress on. And powerfully though, right? Not banally, not because I, woke up one day and said I would like to go get closer to such things. But let's say to properly something like fighting, like combat, like even in a competitive form, in a kind of sportive fashion, but still in ways that affect importantly even the mind, the body, right? Combat is concrete, is material, right? When we talk about warfare and we say that concretely, the objective of war is compelling the enemy to fulfill your will, fundamentally, is the theory. Then von Clausewitz says the practice means that you have to physically annihilate the enemy armed forces, right? Because that's fundamentally what it passes through, meaning that if the enemy stands, it's all about the motivation, the moral force. That is to say, if there is an army standing, it's because this thing can fight. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any fight, right? That's sometimes these are literally the ABCs of how why of course politics is the first thing, right? It's not the military aspect in itself. And this issue, like even of fighting, putting yourself into a game, I actually always refused. When I was younger, I wanted to get in at some point in reenactment or this HEMA stuff, right? And for those who have, I talked a few about these things, but what my opinion is. I'm very skeptical about the positive, application of such activities for in a heuristic sense for the sake of scientific understanding of what war is concretely about. Not because they're the single things are in absolute terms not important. They are, right? Fighting in that way, controlling yourself, it's probably the single most important thing. In my view, however, without even here digressing in the details and how these things happen, even in more violent things like Bohart and all these things, do not actually meet those with those criteria that we can observe even in a squalid brawl, right? That can be in fact more motivated from a moral point of view, right? And that's always the element we're lacking. As I often say, it's not because you just dress up like a medieval knight that this confers you any kind of concrete awareness of what it meant to even just from an individual point of view that war really was about. Because if you're not going out there to kill people, or even if it was just simulating a tournament, but you don't have the background and the motivations and even if you may have some important forces for that, because maybe you go there to fight your own demons and that has a specific meaning of maybe you spent years doing that, so you're definitely motivated, but still there is something lacking there for what that should make it differ from simply a kind of a sport of even an entertainment really meant in the serious sense of the activity, because there is obviously a positive end to that, and I'm supportive of such initiatives. But with the actual thing that it's meant even not to simulate, of course, again, you're not there to kill people like in a real war, but that eventually it goes so astray from the point that it was the one of the person of the time that, and about which we know also so few from a strictly scientific point of view, that is, say, historically, we just don't know certain specific things that would be enough just to say, is what you're doing actually effective, right? But the reason why I never got into these things, first of all, and it was essentially a calculation. That is to say, first of all, I should know what the past was, right? I should know, and then I got acquainted to the art of war and began to study it, and I realized that, yes, there could be maybe a part of me who was biased that said, I maybe just don't want to accept that I spent all this time studying and even sacrificing other activities and relationships and so on for the sake of such learning. But concretely, because I measured the fact that as absolutely important such things could be in relative terms to properly what the historical deal is, they may be not worthy of the time, not worthy of the energy of the work, right? It's again, I know that there are many of you who also belong to such groups and that even ask me things, right? I have had Hemaists asking me certain things about war, right? Of course, I think that they know more about certain technical aspects. I've seen it. For example, I'm not an archaeologist, so I literally don't know how to build an armor myself, right? I could put myself into that, but I realize it's a universe on its own, just like, the art of war is a universe on its own. What I think is that the art of war, given that it encompasses simply a larger scale amount of things, is already a much bigger deal than just knowing what an armor is built like, and especially knowing that doesn't quite make much of a difference at that higher scale, right? That can make a lot of difference for a single individual, but the relations which those individuals stand between each other are way more important than the way they are equipped, right? And this is all the base on which the art of war, combined armed tactics and all the development of warfare has, with a quite evident growth throughout the millennia, is based concretely, right? Already to make people understand this, sometimes I struggle, and that's part of the reason why I let's say I never argued actually with green actors or emists. And when I did, I wish it hadn't been the person I had fallen in love with, and that left me likely because of that. But which didn't quite occur explicitly, but I think I gave her a scare that probably started to think higher, that I wasn't, that probably she didn't even see where I was coming from with that, and so part of the reason why I'm doing these videos is also like trying to make a point about this, and even coming to terms with certain things that I go through, because it's been hard for me, but I think that it's understanding them, and also, and especially these things such as the art of war, is a way to heal yourself, right? It's reaching beyond what you know, because at the end of the day, what is a qualitative moral life if it is not about growing up, if it is not about taking always the next step in order to achieve something. If you want just to keep your world small, like how could you, like I wouldn't know how I could wake up in the morning at that level. Like that is, how could I stop to that? Of course, we all stop to a level where we feel reasonably pressured by doing what we love, and at the same time, having in fact a normal drawing satisfaction from that. We all have that limit, but in potential, right? What is a lifetime if there is no development in that? And that's the issue that actually brings me to be ever more incompatible or alienated or misunderstood, because I feel it even as in these terms from my subjective side. I mean, I was saying, if you don't develop yourself, right? If you stop there, right? You may think that I'm an egoist, or that I am, I don't know. People, what disappoints me, honestly, because you would think it's the flattering thing, but it's actually not. It's when people say, because you are an intellectual, because you have all this knowledge, it's as if, I impress people because, I don't know, of my title, which I don't give a shit about, right? I'm kind of myself, right? I'm kind of proud, of course, of having attained that, but what I learned is something else. Like, it's as if that is a formality, it's a paper, it's a mechanism through which I got through some. But what I've done it completely by myself, and I hate to be considered like an intellectual or somebody who was just about the mind. Right, I'm not that kind of person. I've never been that kind of person. I've always been kind of cerebral. Yes, it is true. I've always been kind of sensitive. I've always kind of been curious. I always wanted to understand things. But these are things that I was way before I was any kind of developed person. Right, even as a child. Meaning also from an intellectual point of view. It's not that, of course, I'm not choosing that path, but it's not who I am. And the reason why I say this, again, is because it's as if, it's a bit like with von Clausewitz, it's as if we were, every time, this is a bit of a cultural fault that we spread here and there. I don't know where culturally speaking it started from, in which countries, in which kind of background, but let's say the idea that we always have to be kind of iconoclastic or desecrating towards any grand theory, right, that has, even when that has something to follow. You see, in the 20th century, we disappointed ourselves greatly because the quality of our, in fact, scientific thinking, properly in a comprehensive terms, has declined, right? It's not because we improved our scientific understanding that we are capable of replicating the means through which we could arrive to that understanding, right? And so I understand that, yeah, I mean, when we look at the big figures, the big pictures, even like at levels like these, how many podcasts do you actually follow? How there are very famous people out there who make a lot of money and that are, I mean, from one side they say reasonable things, but from the other side they don't really say that much, right? They don't really have this particularly developed vision of because they probably don't challenge themselves tremendously about that. They probably perceive that growth, they acquired a certain knowledge, they understood it. But how anxious are they to reach beyond, rather than sticking to a specific, you know, system, right? And that they cannot, let's say, be improved. Of course, they understand that there is always an improvement, but the idea that we should go beyond a bit by default, right? And so that we can always be a better self, better ourselves. There should be always a constant effort in this. I don't see it there. It is also dangerous, right? In part, it could be literally alienating. It could even bring you in dangerous waters in terms of, I don't know, literally losing the plot, having a kind of a tunnel vision that leads you astray to the point of insanity, right? Because it's obvious that the greater amount your mind is able to encompass and kind of more challenge you feel, right? This has an enormous cost, which is not just about learning it. Because you think that learning things is maybe, it's about making it easy. In practice, it does make things easier because you kind of understand them even before they're explained to you, because you acquire the kind of sixth sense, so you know more or less what is going on the base of other experience. But the question is also, at that point, are you in touch yourself with, maybe you're right still, but are you enough in touch with people for them to understand you anymore? This is not maybe my case, because I think that what I say is, at the end of the day, pretty understandable. Like, doesn't require an enormous effort. I know that on YouTube, like, the attention span is very low, so even following an idea or a speech or whatever is not so, it is not to be given for granted, to say the least. But concretely, when it comes to understanding, this can be just for the military, but let's say that, as we know, everything political, social, military kind of reflects on each other, right? You cannot quite, and that's the Clausewitsian Trinity, right? This great intuition, that is to say, literally, everything, if you look at a community, everything you learn politically about that is actually mirrored, right? It's not that it's another thing. It actually mirrors, almost as if it were a mathematical equation, the social and the military situations, and vice versa, like with everything, right? So the other concept is, of course, that if you miss, let's say, one of these three things, which can easily happen because we are hardly experts on politics, society, and warfare altogether, right? Because these fields are very different, right? So they require an important set of skills of understanding that you may not immediately have in itself at at that level of expertise that is necessary. For example, I focus mostly on warfare, and it's obvious that I kind of study also politics in war. If you wonder why I make those videos about kind of general history or not necessarily military history, that's kind of my medicine to cure myself, of course, of the almost completely military aspect of the story. But it's also kind of difficult at that point to study warfare without encompassing broader political and social dynamics, right? And in that sense, even the relations within which such the three elements of the Trinity stand between each other are probably different. I still have to research on that. But let's say, at least for me, it's very easy from the military background, because this is, for example, what was my research about. To grasp certain political and social dynamics, which sometimes made me conflict even with people who had, for example, just studied those but not studied really a bit the rest. And probably I also have, I don't think that, like, I understand everything. I don't think that, again, just said, because you study war in a decent fashion, you can't understand directly all the rest. But let's say, intuitively, also for what you know and what you should come to know, even if you want to talk about warfare, as political and social context is necessary, let's say there were certain dynamics that likely were of comparable dimension, like maybe in the details that I wouldn't know, but I could also make examples about this at some point when we talk about the thesis and all, because that's quite instructive to see how much even the scholar is sometimes oblivious of certain things that really matter, and make important mistakes in a sense. So you would say, what does this have to do with the title of the video? What's about the art of war here, and why it is important, really? Well, it's a specific realization that it is about this kind of setting, because again, how do we learn factually war? Because war seems to be more specifically technical than the other fields, right? We can't argue that, I believe that politics, war, and society are of equal importance among each other, right? The point, though, is that when we talk about war, we talk mostly about the war, of course, that is fought historically, which is to divide here theory from practice, meaning that for war to happen, it's not that there isn't a military, let's assume a state is at peace, right? Doesn't have kind of military activity of relevant sort. Does that mean that in that war that the military element of the Trinity, so that third of the same, is actually out of the scene? Well, of course no, right? That would be a gross mistake, and we tend to make it. We tend to make it, especially when we have this prudent kind of puritanic attitude towards, war itself, right? The same name of war is kind of scary and terrible, and we shouldn't even think about war because it's dangerous. We studies war as kind of a crypto-fascist or nationalist or racist or some sort, or a warmonger, bloodthirsty maniac or something like that. This is what, unfortunately, culturalism has spread as an ideology, right? It's no different than many other, poisonous ideologies that, we are constantly exposed to, and it's normal to have in a civilization. They're not quite a good indicator when they kind of become prevalent, right? If we look at what is going on in the world right now, I won't digress it, but it was kind of even predictable that even an event like a pandemic would trigger certain dynamics that people wouldn't see, because we tend to stop simplistically to, in fact, considering these fields as if they were all separate. The reason why it's wrong not to understand that there is a military element all the time in all of our lives at the end of the day, because this is true for the community, but it's true for the same individuals, is pretending that our potential to be violent, that is to make war, because that's literally what it is, didn't exist until we become violent ourselves. And this is wrong, right? Because that potential and the thoughts and the triggers and the frustrations and the aggressiveness and the hatred and the resentment are always there. That is what we see mostly as us being, pissed off by something. When we go out in the street, when in coexistence with other people, at that point, it may end with, just look at this imbecile, how he stands in the doorway when you go on the bus, for getting out. Well, at that point you would just behave in a certain way that wouldn't lead to any escalation. Maybe if you were not a person but 60 million people, that would escalate in an airstrike, right? Maybe killing 30. So conflict is, of course, at the root of human interaction, like in a sense the same way we relate to the external world in terms of tolerance, intolerance towards the external is exactly the same. It's always conflictual, right? We exist because of selection. That is to say, it's not that we struggle through a hostile environment of some sort, right? Independently from whether we're fighting against other people or some kind of against physics in the first place. But let's say that our fitness as human beings fundamentally derives from such capacity to withstand crisis, from our resistance, from even our offensiveness, because we may need to take action in order to achieve that. And of course, we cannot consider this aspect as if it was disjointed by everything we do, right? Even from our own genes that are factually evolved um, from nature on the base of the same logic, right? From which that we cannot eradicate. So that's one of the greatest mistakes why we presume that even just dialectically this would be just enough to debunk culturalism in the first place, but it's not much just about that. It's properly um, acknowledging that the reasons why we should think about war and how to fix it and to wage it are essentially the same ones for which we fight our small wars every day, right? In a way or in another. It's always most of the times a mind game, right? And it's not surprising that war is defined by von Clausewitz exactly this struggle between moral forces that also that reciprocally influence each other. Another thing that we tend to scientifically cut out from the equation is to realize that we're not talking about isolated dynamics that we can't study as if they were just existing on their own, right? First of all, we don't know what humanity is on their own unless we study what human people, what people do in the first place. But it doesn't make any sense from a methodological point of view to pretend that there is any other way to relate ourselves to it, such as, for example, just teaching kids that, I don't know, war is bad and that they shouldn't think about it, which is like saying, basically reject any kind of, value of resistance, of self-defense, or even of offensive capacity that is needed to save somebody else, for that matter, because we are dishabituating them to this resistance capacity, right? It's not much that let's say that the world is getting worse for some particular reason coming from the external. It's the same individuals that are getting weaker. That is, we are not educating human beings, to become stronger individuals. We're essentially buying them by promising them always easier life, always, something that everything goes wrong fundamentally must be fixed because it's not fair. Life is unfair, right? And this doesn't mean that we shouldn't solve our problems the best possible, but we shouldn't be being fed with the delusion that we are owed something by anyone or by the world or anything in the first place, right? On the contrary, we should be very thankful for the fact that we are alive in the first place, that we can do things ourselves, and that this seems an enormous potential, an enormous field of investment. It makes a lot of sense under any point of view. That it should be based on action, right? And so when we think about war, say violence, the military dimension, which are basically all the same thing, we should understand that there is no way we can understand that if we don't study specifically what war is. It's paradoxical. It sounds like, what are you saying? Of course, you can't understand war if you don't study war. Yes, but it's ideologically we are misguided to the idea of war itself, as we just said. So that's where the art of war actually comes into play, because the art of war is war itself, right? It's the practice, it's the reality, right? It's the experience, it's the notion. So as we were saying before, it's not that I can't go out there participating into a war, because I know dramatically well that even if I went in a real one, it wouldn't, even just as a single fighter without any specific, either, the position of command essentially and or political influence, in relevant one at least. I wouldn't actually get by itself too much of it, right? It would be a very interesting, experiment for when it comes to what it means in practice to experience certain things, which is important. But I wouldn't still be explain how war is factually waged. That is to say, again, war there doesn't work just because a person like me or anybody else would go into that and would make their own part. That is crucial. That is fundamental. That's, of course, how humans have always fought wars, without also having ever been taught how it would be the case. Of course, there is some kind of civilizational and therefore kind of artificial growth in that regard. But I mean, that exists in evolution in itself, even just because we are social animals, we live in groups and so on. So that even can't really be disjuncted from the human nature in itself. But the art of war, in this sense, is literally an art, right? When we speak of the art of war, it seems like somebody was painting a military picture situation. Of course not. I mean, I doubt that people thinking like that. But when, as I was saying before, that kind of desecrating and iconoclastic idea, the art of war, right? These are the terms that people who sent, I don't know, millions of people to die for no reason filled their mouths. But well, that's also kind of a pretty lame view of the world, for that matter. I will not start digressing again on the fact that you don't really know better how to make war than the alleged butchers of World War the First, and you really don't, right? This is the beauty of studying these things, that you understand when the person is completely deluded about that, because again, there is the presumption that again, it's like that promise that you can't, that everything is easy if you're owed this. You're not owed to your opinion to be validated just because you have an opinion, right? It doesn't work like that. It has to pass through an astonishing work that is really astonishing because it took millennia in order to build up, right? So chances are that, especially if you don't have any specific background regarding that topic or whatever, you won't be able to understand its complexity by yourself, right? It's mathematically impossible. If you don't have the elements to learn it, you just don't, right? And it's typical for human beings too to mechanically assemble some approximations to make up for, of course, what they can't learn immediately, but they kind of think they want to have a grasp on the essentials. Well, sometimes this is exactly the problem, that the essentials are outlined poorly, are misinterpreted, but probably poorly explained, right? If I had to tell you where you can find an adequate education in the art of war, from which source, of course I would immediately address you to the Krieg by itself. But out there, how many people really do study this thing and do it with the connection to the actual practice of war that we can study historically? It's two different things, you see, one, I don't want to approximate, let's say, but there are so many examples even in here of different, let's say, I'm the person would be more interested in finding people who actually study these things as well, and kind of being part of that group and kind of dwelling there, right? Just imagine how cool it would be, right? You have, of course, you would be even more competitive, maybe even brought down by that. That's part of the reason also why people don't like maybe to be exposed to these ideas, because they feel as if they felt dumb, right? They said and that's why they would come up with the thing of saying, because you know so much, you just I just can't make it. So instead of kind of opening your mind, you kind of regress and turn away. That's not really the point. Like, first of all, you should understand that if we study certain things, it's because we want kind of to help others, because at the end of the day, that's the goal, right? Why would you do anything in your life for pure profit? To do what, right? I think just an aborted intellect of a mature being would think that the only purpose in life is that you kind of find a way to make money and just you spend this money to do nothing, right? There is always, or to do things that are just purely, I don't know, sensual pleasure, things that you just consume, right? Doesn't make any sense. Like, we all manage our lives exactly in this way, even if we wanted that at the beginning, by adapting to the difficulties, to how we handle things. We realize that after all, we have a precarious balance, and that it's astonishing how human beings are actually capable of balancing themselves and are already kind of balanced by default. So from that standpoint, again, why don't you spring forward in terms of self-development? Because that is the most effective way to eventually achieve in that measure that you would like to. So it's obvious that if we lack such companionship, let's say, we tend to also grow a more obscure and, in a sense, even more super mystic view of the world, like kind of an idea of tragic hero, of the fall of the gods, or all these things. This is, but it's still, I mean, kind of more worth in a sense to and to go on like along that track, even when we see that at some point we've lost so much behind. But even the same von Clausewitz says that if you have, like, you should always, this is the paradox also of, that among the other things that the art of war teaches you, is that there is a struggle, of course, between, let's say, pretending that we knew everything so that we could never make a mistake, and actually taking the chance and doing it. Right? There are ways and ways of doing things. There is no doubt. And the same von Clausewitz, of course, says, so there is something that obstacles your way, which in war is the default situation at all time. You should always adapt to this. You should respond to that in relation to it, at least. Not passively, even just, there are certain situations which may you're forced to give up the initiative. But we have seen how this, of course, has to do always with a final positive action, right? So even if you lose the initiative, it's mostly for defense. It's for defense fundamentally, and you should always pass to counterattack, because that's the ideal defense in its nature. So it's always bringing it forward in a way or another, and it's obvious that you cannot at a certain point start listening to the siren saying, if you had done this, at this point you would be different. Excuse me. No, I don't have COVID. I have just, post-dinner issues. So there is a moment which you have to balance out what you want to do, the way you see it, right? Go forward along that way, but then going, and all the other things that you have left behind. And of course, this is the purpose of it, right? Increasing in scale that understanding. Why is the art of war connected with all this? I mean, at the root, at the core of this idea, because of course, and again, even here I will not complain about the academy, all the problems that things are going bad, there is no studying anymore, and all these things. It is true, in my opinion. I mean, it's evident, it's real, but at the same time, there is still, that lack of disorientation that probably always existed, because nobody fundamentally developed that kind of vision since the beginning, since we had the actual opportunities of doing it. That is to say, pretending to study war without knowing how war is waged. Now, tell me, what sense does this have, right? We write a lot about war, right? As a civilization currently, we do, right? We acknowledged, of course, and I think we never kind of needed to do that. That's just a permanent condition. That war is an important thing. That whatever it is, whatever you like it or dislike it, because you may like war, right? You may like war because it's frightening, because it's kind of beautiful in so many things. It shows you how far can human civilization reach in terms of ingenuity, of strength, of vision, of capacity. It means a lot, right? It's terrifying, but it's also beautiful. You may understand, like at this point, also that is kind of always going to be there. It's never going to leave. There are various acknowledgments you can realize, but they all circle around one point exactly. That is to say, first of all, like what is this, right? What is that we are documenting, right? If we don't teach the art of war, that is fundamentally how to wage war concretely, knowing how warfare changes, right, on the historical path, which is the only one possible essentially to understand what, in that sense, war is waged and can be waged in other ways, realistically, is derives from history, of course. We cannot quite understand that. Like, that is studying, saying that you study war because, you study the impact of war on, child traumas. I mean, it can be a beautiful humanitarian thing to do, but that doesn't actually tell you what war is. That's not a military study strictly meant, right? Studying, the logistical chains during the world wars, the connection with the industry, with production, all these things can be great, can tell you so much about war that back, but it's not war. It doesn't actually tell you that, right? It's as if you're studying something that is connected to war, but while war is happening somewhere else, so you don't see it, right? Same goes for technology, right? Even the other day I was looking, somebody studying the issues of longbow determinism, how to call because also language is going to generate at the point we don't even explain what things mean when we write them. In I don't know whether it was like the Hundred Years' War in itself or something narrower, but say according to the opinion of De Vries and I don't know what other text, like this assignment, which I presume was an essay for university, of a guy from, I don't say where he came from, but doesn't matter. Or it actually would matter because it was not just it was not a bad country. It's actually one of those countries where allegedly to be advanced in those kind of things, and kind of also native of the same books, and that are revered because scholarship there is more important than sources in a sense, or there's other considerations. Is it shouldn't even be an issue, right? You can maybe study, let's say, I understand what that essay was, even without reading the assignment or whatever. It was essentially the old issue of, let's say, how much longbow kind of impacted like the outcome of main battles of the 100 Years' War. And the easy answer is we don't know. And but even if we knew, we would be pretty sure that it wasn't decisive. There was nothing deterministic about that, right? That the longbow, already considering the longbow in itself, without outside of a combined arm, tactic, is wrong, right? I don't doubt that it might have helped that the same, it's the tactics were required the longbow and not the other way around. So this already dialectically frames the thing in a completely different fashion, for which that essay is completely worthless, unless you're actually criticizing what those authors were maybe buying, kind of. And it was, I believe, a poor assignment in the sense that, first of all, those texts, they do not really talk about that in those terms. But secondly, you should already know, as an alleged military historian, which surprisingly was also kind of a reenactor that produces weapons, right? Builds weapons we want to do. That it's a question that doesn't even make sense. That the answer is this exercise is pointless. You can criticize whether those scholars bought into that, which they actually didn't, but you can maybe refine the idea of how, let's say, in fact, how much importance they gave to that factor in the outcome of those battles. But at the end of the day, you're not really adding anything to the, let's say, comprehensive to the development, to the reconstruction of those battles in the first place, which is interesting because, for example, I don't like how De Vries reconstructed certain battles. It's not that they were wrong; it's that the method didn't go to determine, didn't go close to try to understand what kind of balances of force within that reality were, and how, in fact, those factors that were eventually listed in as important, and they were in part, how they actually interplay within each other, what kind of judgment we can express about the fact that, yes, there are a bunch of factors that seem to be common to these battles, but how much did they interplay in that, and how much can we know? That would have been the next step, to actually understand how certain, and this study, as far as I understand, it's never been done, right? It's never been done. I may be actually the only person who studied this at some point for some battles of the early 14th century, and not those ones, by the way, but certain closer contact. Yes, something about Crécy at some point, but not really in the comprehensive stuff like that, because I studied other battles, and the outcome was decent, right? We figured out certain things that historiography had completely missed, in fact, because they hadn't studied how armies actually fought, to try to determine how strong a certain army was over another, and why, and with that specific political social background. I mean, look at what De Vries wrote in that early 14th century infantry warfare, right? Is there anything political, social? No, it's a crude tactical analysis, which I'm a huge fan of tactical analysis, right? But you should eventually substantiate them well with, yeah, how do we connect this with the political and social systems that produce them? Because otherwise it's like a football match. What are you looking at? What are you doing? You're rolling the dice and saying, a certain amount of time there was this factor in the battle, and some other times in these various battles were not really compared, just listing these things in common, and then not even explaining what we can say from that, what we can derive from that, and trying to give a dimension to it, not even concentrating on how important like a single arm concretely was on the other, and how much we can assess that, and still telling battles as if they were like just because somebody lost or won, right? That had specifically to do with even the intrinsic quality, for example, of one arm over the other. Certain topics that were not even addressed. And why were they not addressed? And these are kind of the top scholars we have about these specific topics and people revere, etc. Because of course nobody studies properly the art of war, right? And the fact that they didn't do this exercise is exactly what they missed. That's exactly what studying the art of war is, right? So there is a lot of laziness, and there is a lot of carcass eating, like to say, even these essays written on, it can be a useful exercise, but to what end? Like, again, what's the heuristic specific weight of an essay of that kind? That will you make kind of more knowledgeable in concrete terms to surpass, to achieve some to cross certain threshold, or getting to the next level of the understanding of medieval art of war? No, right? It's just scratching the surface of something that it's not even being fundamentally capable itself to study the art of war in a correct way, and that you are kind of also feeding in the measure in which you give it importance for itself. I quoted those works myself, but I quoted them for the sake of documentation of some some concepts, some phrases, not because comprehensively I thought of them to be who knows what in that regard. So my issue with the point we have arrived at this point to understanding reality is that I could extend easily to any other subject at this point, because after having seen this in a field like history, I can give you it's a bit more chaotic, but it's still also theory, for this reason it should be a bit more careful, and it is by default to say certain things rather than others. How also the other fields actually work. I'm worried about what the fate of our civilization. It's not even pessimism. It is literally, how can you handle the system if you don't even have the instruments to analyze it correctly, right? So we're talking about medieval warfare, okay, but as you know, I always advocate for the fact that for a comparative and diachronic study of the art of war. That is to say, again, you cannot quite understand even medieval warfare or even those battles enucleated just like that if you don't have another term of comparison, right? In other words, even things like the military revolution, why were they born historiographically, conceptually? Because somebody fixated on a certain time where certain things were happening, and they had, of course, for the sake of self-promotion and or this kind of need for spectacularization. I don't even want to criticize the individual reasons why the single scholars do these things. It's just, you already know that they're garbage, right? Because you frame them in a pattern, in a methodological boundary that fundamentally doesn't make sense already since the beginning, right? You should build that at the throughout the work, not really before, and then building the whole thing over that concept, right? Certain levels of analysis that, in my opinion, were quite poor. Again, I don't think that in order to write such a book like the military revolution, you can accept. Of course, at the time it was less about that, so that's also what we do sometimes. That is, if nobody really wrote anything about that, you tend to to have it easier in a way. But still, a bit of, even for like of that if you write something bad, somebody will criticize that. And so in fact it was a huge backlash that was not driven again even there, because there were other serious competent military historians who said, no, this is not true, because no, the answers were the war of the worst kind, right? Why? Now I can't descend into detail of that specific question, but what I was actually comparing this thing is that if there was a military revolution like between the end of the 15th and essentially the mid-17th century, like what happened exactly afterwards in the second half of the 17th century, and in eventually in the 18th, right, mostly towards the end, where the time, from the mid, let's make it a continuity because of France, of what had developed lasted in the beginning of the 18th century. By the mid, we have Frederick II. Eventually, we have the French Revolution, then Napoleon, etc. But concretely, at that point, that is the huge boom and the scalar explosion of Western military capacity, whereas, the previous century was not really a revolution, right? Nor it was in the sense that there was an inversion of trend, or you can frame dialectically such a thing like the development of pike and shock tactics from essentially just, say pike and bow at that point to linear tactics, pure musketry, let's say, excuse me, are considerable, like in a disjuncted way, in a kind of progressive way, for which you can even spot kind of a revolution and inversion of trend, right? Because also firearms took half of a millennium before achieving that, right? And that transition. And why should we, by the way, stop to eventually the accomplishment of linear tactics by itself? It's like a conceptual. You see, Occam was right. We don't have to create more more boundaries, more problems, putting more obstacles to when these things are fictitious. They don't even exist. For what? Just for framing your field of research? I didn't. Right? If I had to write about certain things as I did, I just explained that you need some arbitrary boundaries, but you don't have to consider them as such. That there is always a before and afterwards. That this also influences the way you research what happens in the middle, and that you have to be aware, and of course that things have to be improved. But it's kind of easy to understand. Like even if you set that trend, so in that method, it's obvious. Right? If you really are interested in understanding what the hell happened, you would do that. Well, again, the level of inquiry of the massive, by the way, material that exists for early modern warfare, to the point of just sticking to some, arbitrary parameters, such as the news that at some point are very dubious, by the way, all over the world in those centuries. That, I don't know, we're told the Chinese used pike and shock at some point in a certain way or another. I mean, yes, those are all maybe first things that you can write at the beginning by yourself, but they're so vague by themselves. If you don't have an expertise about that specific background and context to actually dimension, that you cannot build up a structure that presumably holds, and it won't, on the base of such gossip at the same point. It doesn't really work like that. I know better also because I understand what the mistake is, because at the beginning I thought it could be done in the same way. At the beginning I thought that the art of war could be studied by, I don't know, in one chronicle we have the example of a I don't know, we have the news that infantry beat cavalry there. And therefore, we should take it in consideration as a matter of, let's extraneate it from any context whatsoever, and let's take it just as a proof, and let's put it in the bucket, as if we were at a supermarket where we get all we want, and then we just arrange the how these things have to stick together afterwards, right? And without further inquiring that, you need a thorough inquiry of the whole picture. There you should study up to the last engagement and realizing what the practice in the reality of warfare concretely was, because that news will not be standing on their feet, because their feet are the context where they were taken from. So since this takes an astonishing amount of time, because of course even Parker could have not written that thing in the first place, so somebody must have the courage even of starting by making such a mistake, but at least, maybe with a better insight about what the concretely the method at least should be scientifically. There is no other way to understand that world but to literally studying every single engagement like that, because otherwise you will simply remain. And again, I've experimented the thing myself with a legitimate doubt that things might not be at all how you think that warfare concretely was. It's always the same of stories. It's the oversimplification of the system. You presume that a few indicators are that you pick for no concrete reason are enough to say that are maybe stand out just because they are either easier to find or they're kind of more representative. Yes, but again, what's the criterion for which you choose them if you don't explain first of all what the context was, right? I was told, for example, my research was a lot of stuff because I literally made this work in depth, and people wouldn't be willing to read those. And who the fuck cares about other people? I listed the exact list amount of all the engagements that were photo. I analyzed them. They're written, they're printed on paper. If you're really interested about my question, you go there and study it. I don't care that the book is long, right? It's your problem, not mine. As long as I stick to a scientific method and an adequate method level of approximation, that again, you have, by the way, a much higher, lower level of fact of concreteness. Why should I make up for it, right? And instead, that's what we have habituated to. We teach kids to produce a bunch of garbage just to make it then think that they have a curriculum, that they have publications, and therefore we transform these people eventually, the next generations of scholars that are simply, they don't know what they're doing. And this is reflected by the quality of the publishing. And it's pretty damn serious, right? It may be exhausting to work in the way I propose, but at the same time, what do you want to do? Why should you approximate something if you kind of know that there is substantially more to know, right? I could have listed, thousands of engagement there and missed, I don't know, others. Yes, but I kind of made like a 95%, so I presume that statistically, that's kind of a good level approximation. If you pick just 5% of the engagements, those are the indicative ones, but you miss the other 95% of the wall, and you don't make even people know what that wall is about, what's the value of that research? I mean, scientifically, it doesn't mean anything, right? It's just like a rigged, survey. We know that it's that simple, but we sometimes miss the. Let's say we're too tolerant, right? This is a problem of a civilization. When it becomes too tolerant, it's not much about the external; it's about themselves. You cannot have intolerance, say, or tolerance of something because you presume you can fix if you're not a strong person who is capable of rejecting yourself. And that's why we are, again, flattering people that they are somewhat special, whatever they do or whatever, because it's a way of, of softening up, because we don't see inherently with that kind of, panorama of research from the side of the people who should, be effective scientists, in a comprehensive sense, that we don't see anything around. We are not aware of the fog that surrounds us. We're not aware of the misunderstanding and the enormous loss that and the lack of potential, the lack of the wasted potential actually that that we could enact right in practice that goes completely lost for no valid reason. For no valid reason. We shouldn't be more lenient at all. And so the art of war is fundamental, again, because it teaches you exactly how these armies fundamentally were brought there to fight as such, right? It's not just, again, studying a battle. Even if I specialize in tactics myself, and and it is productive because in a sense they are easier to reconstruct, so there is a higher degree of reliability than say reconstructing properly the strategical employment, which because the strategic picture is much more complex, right? And we cannot, and it intertwines with politics, so we cannot fully understand that comprehensively. But studying something that also falls outside the realm of war per se, and so there it becomes also more complex, of course. But I've observed that understanding how an army is properly used in a campaign, and what kind of standards, let's say on the base of operationally speaking, this thing had, when is that they came to engagement, for which reason, with which preoccupations, with which ideas, what would they thought would happen in battle, and of course you can reconstruct it also on the base of the plans, of the behavior, etc., is crucial in order to understand how the military instrument was factually employed. If you just study how war, I don't know, devastates the countryside, you don't study war. You study economics, right? You study something else that it may be very interesting, is surely connected to the whole thing, because war was made also largely to that purpose in a way. But again, if you don't study the modalities in which the ways this happened, it can hardly serve to any purpose for the understanding of war itself. And if one doesn't understand the art of war, for any time in history, cannot understand the employment of the military instrument in their own time, whichever it is, from the side that they are more invested, or like let's say individually, that is essentially politics, right? So don't be hyped by who serves you a certain product just because they are in theory the smart ones. Let's say be needy, demand something in terms of the explanation of why they know this and why they think this and what measure they have to propose you, to provide you with that information. That is crucial. That is fundamentally the most important thing in the scientific method. And the art of war must be known in this regard because it also exposes you directly to the scale of war, right? I think that when I didn't learn of this, I still was thinking I was interested in war, but I saw it obviously in a much more irrealistic way, because more than else I lacked the almost properly the quantitative dimension of such phenomena, right? I couldn't connect them with profitably just with a political social aspect. I mean, understanding that, I don't know, you employ 100 divisions rather than 200 can make it's difficult to visualize if you again have never thought of what this means, of what was the cost of that, what impact fundamentally this had on the system, and how the system could use it therefore and would use it therefore, right? That's why it's necessary to pass through that, and not just to do it for a specific theater or specific time. That has to happen throughout all human history. It has to go through the organics, the doctrine, for of course the actual sources on campaigns and battles, more or less at least a large amount of time, a large amount of countries, because either we accept that there is a standard, or that we should even give up the thing, right? Because we can't even affect others in this regard. Of course we cannot substitute. Of course, this does create a tension between people. It does make them touchy. It does make you appear as picky and kind of intolerant or something, that you just don't, you think, who knows what you have acquired. But again, what's the purpose of showing otherwise if you know that's the correct thing by practice? These videos make us strange because to me, this sounds a bit as the most crucial aspect in the world matter, not just for history, but for any other subject, any other field. And my my vision of this is is permeating the whole reality, right? You can transpose it to politics, to society. As we were saying in the beginning, you cannot quite get what's the importance of war until you study it to the point you understand how they waged armies. They led armies in the field, in campaign. Of course, this cannot substitute the direct, the direct commanding experience. But let's say gnoseologically, the way we study war fundamentally is always this one. That is to say, even if you were part of that, like there are few people in position of command that can even, provide you, even from their specific perspective, like a comprehensive view of the world without reconstructing the broader picture. Von Clausewitz also talked about this. Again, participating into a battle has a lot to do, of course, with what you see with your own eyes about certain situations, but the comprehensive picture must be studied, must be reconstructed, right? It's not easy. There are the way we sometimes even can. What's another indicator that if you ever fear to be fooled about these things is when people are essentially trying to propinate you the version of, let's say, how this battle really went. How many things have been written, I don't know, about the Battle of Waterloo, right? And let's say the Battle of Waterloo was fundamentally known how it happened since the 19th century, right? There was an extensive historiography on it. The documents were studied, the battle was reconstructed, were still the people who took part to it that fundamentally explained how things went on in the picture. Of course, there is a higher commanding understanding of what is going on. I mean, of course, Napoleon would know, and the people who worked with him would know about what was happening at Waterloo, what the plans were. So it's not that you can't have, again, a compare, but it is also to be, of course, checked for what other, literally what should be like a military historical analysis, like all the possible sources you can put together from all the people who partook there, the battle, studying the terrain, looking at what the whole thing was, and in perspective also what was the quality of those troops, right? And this goes also beyond, of course. That is why the context is fundamental. The single battle, it has to do with, of course, with the strategic scenario, but also with like what was that army become, like the French one, the British one, the Prussian. I mean, it's all from there you can measure qualities practically that in other ways you couldn't quite do, right? But again, when we reconstruct this, we do it historically. We don't do it by essentially drawing it from, I don't know, a sacred spring because the guy was there. Therefore, it's important to know what that person knew, depending on the position of command. But at the same time, we are reconstructing the thing as it were a completely different one. So the point I'm making is that most self-proclaimed military historians do not actually study this. Do not actually care. They have an idealized view of war that they pursue because it's easier to pursue. It goes around things. It doesn't try to make sense forcefully of certain things that they would require too much work. Sometimes to write an article or something else. They effectively don't care very much even about this, but because let's say history could be at that point be split in so many things. History is huge, is enormous, right? But it doesn't mean that therefore everything you pick has the same importance. Instead, this seems to have become the deal. The smaller the deal, the more articles you can publish. Yes, okay, but this means that those articles suck, right? That they have a lower weight, that they don't actually get to the point of some juicy, because there is also, and legitimately, a bit of strategy regarding, how much you want to put out in terms of, explaining what warfare is about and so on. But And there are so many fixes where you don't want to remain stuck, and it's dangerous. Sometimes there are sources we don't understand. Sometimes we literally struggle to reconcile. It's about the mechanics of history as well, the way you quote, the way you put things together, and people may ask you a lot of insidious questions as well. Why did you do this? What did you see? What you didn't see? So history in general provides you at least a bit with that awareness. So in part, this simplified method is a reaction to many things that are already happening. It's not just an academic problem per se. It's obviously, in fact, even here, it's a broader issue. And the problem, though, is that we tend, again, to dismiss anything that comes, let's say, a bit as a novelty and a criticism at the same time. For example, the other day I was reading about how we make mistakes in historiography, right? This happens all the time, and it of course there is a lot of let's say our writers warning about these issues, but there is also another, and so we should obviously search for mistakes and always criticize. Again, that's probably part of the reason also, but the quality of the academic quality has declined, because perhaps people have stopped searching for those mistakes themselves a bit too much. Maybe it's also because we detached, let's say, common interest, I would say, from the actual topics that are being analyzed. I mean, there are many issues at some point, but there is another idea that is a bit, it's comfortably cheap, and therefore not particularly effective to look at, divergent opinions in general. And it's dangerous, because I know that many of you will buy this as if, who says something different is automatically, a hero, because it goes against the mainstream and all these things. There is not really even such a thing like a mainstream. Let's be honest. We are all very different. There is just, say, agreement, disagreement happens sometimes at other levels rather than the actual side. Politics shows this dramatically well. But it's the idea that, even among the experts, you can fundamentally claim that, if the majority of experts is against it, fundamentally it is, it's likely to be, something is likely to be wrong, right? I have mixed feelings about this, because from one side I do have like if I had to, of course, to trust, like, in a subject that I don't know anything about, if I had to trust the somebody in general, like without knowing even the topic factually, I would presume that the majority of experts in the field should be kind of right, or at least should be closer to the right thing, and that the heretical is probably somebody who who wrote something that is not really correct. But I did see how this thing can turn when you start thinking that those are the experts. That's the thing that we generally skip. That, I don't know, being just being a historian, let's be honest, does it make us kind of automatically understanding everything that we read about history? Like, I believe that, of course, there is, in every field, like, if something is right, you should be able to explain it in a clear manner that doesn't quite confuse and is intelligible for any intelligent person, even who is not expert or particularly competent in a field or another, right? So I did come to sympathize to the minority more than once, and I consider myself a minority at the same time, meaning that, yeah, if I come up with these ideas, chances are that I know I'm not going to be particularly liked. I know I'm going to cause turmoil, and people are going to question certain patterns that I'm taking, and my work is going to be essentially, completely misinterpreted and aggressed and distorted and even manipulated and all these things, and that this can go against me, right? I've never gotten kind of in that situation at the worst of it, but because I believe that what I say, even when controversial, actually is based on a cogent point of some sort, right? I can't be wrong myself. It's easy to be wrong. It's easy to change ideas. In fact, changing ideas is a sign of improvement most of the times. But even the disposition, the openness, the idea you can really be capable of acquiring, integrating another knowledge, changing your perspective is what the sap of scientific wisdom, say. But I know well in this sense that not everything that, sound, because it happened many times in history that, of course, there was somebody who believed something and was dominant in that field. And then somebody came up and said, but this is not really correct because I can explain you why. And before that, and the idea was correct, was better than the other one, but before it surpassed the establishment, it took a while, right? This happens a lot, right? It's very famous. Any academic knows about this, that there is always a resistance against novelty, that there is kind of a club of the guys who maintain the dominion, they hold the power. Unfortunately, yes, science is rigged by these things all the time, and that's one of the main reasons why you are not going necessarily to believe the majority of the experts, because these experts not only may actually not be factually expert about a certain field, about a certain aspect of their field, and nor understand it because they haven't gone through that specific path, but they may have other interests. We are witnessing it today, right? We are witnessing it in the way even we're changing some words, certain definitions. For example, the depathologization of certain. What is a pathology? It's obvious that there is a degree of approximation, but we have a right at the point when we are kind of deep. From one side, we are medicalizing everything about human experiences to say every time you suffer, you should take drugs and that's it, and not kind of grow, a backbone on your own, and surpassing this thing naturally as you're fundamentally as a human being you're supposed to be, and depends of course on what it is, but let's say especially for moral diseases, right? At this point we are weakening ourselves rather than actually bringing any improvement in that kind of quality of life, because we know we can always fall back on something that lays out of ourselves. That's not really good. Because we don't exercise anymore to be that, but that we have arrived to the point at which we shouldn't use a word because that can hurt somebody's feeling, even when we use that word actually to point out something that may help that person. Because it's not because of using that word that the problems lay in, but it's about the fact of not wanting to acknowledge what reality is. And that's what we've arrived to. That's why, in my opinion, the art of war, this is the sap of the video. You cannot understand war until you study how it was fought. It's impossible. It doesn't make any sense. You can't have a moral opinion on war if you literally don't know what even wars are fought like on the field. Not just because just knowing that presents you with from one side the kind of a moral shock first of all, but also the rational, logical understanding of why that was it's either you do that or you don't do it at all. But because war, again, is not really a cultural matter, it's not a fashion, it's not the emotional people that bring the others into it. It's really about who we are. It's really about the fact that a war can break out at so many basically we can't even predict, and that therefore we are all arguably liable of suffering of the consequences. I mean, you would think that history also takes paths that you see, history tends to do this. That we tend to tell, well, to explain, right? The historian normally is appreciated as a kind of reassuring figure, right? Somebody who tells you, we know how this thing happened because we are experts. We tell this and that, blah blah blah, and therefore we give you a sort of pattern to which you understand. Once you understand why World War II was happened in the first place, I don't know. That stays in the past, and you shouldn't worry because it was about understanding why it happened, and then you shouldn't fear about that anymore, or you shouldn't take in consideration the fact that it could happen something similar in your own world, that it naturally is going to be different from that, but that's still the same reasons why it seemed like it was a bad thing at the time could bring today to something very negative to break out for us to neither realizing or understanding or predicting that. And this is not just about war in itself. Think about, I don't know, how quickly the Soviet Union collapsed, right? In a couple of years, essentially. And people didn't even, they didn't know that. Nobody really could predict. It was so sudden. That was the scariest thing of all. It produced, in fact, enormous damages in the way it happened. One would have thought it would have been a long process, it would have taken time. Like, it collapsed in 2 years. All the whole freaking thing. And like, after 7 years, you can't really. Sometimes you're aware, you're in awe of how much this can happen, and this is what also war teaches you, by the way, because war teaches you the unpredictable as a default situation, right? And therefore, even too deterministic, like, war teaches you probably more than any other topic, how it's normal for things that you wouldn't expect to happen all the time, and things that you wouldn't literally expect, not that you kind of expected, but you thought, no, literally things that fall out of the realm of what you even thought could arrive to happen plausibly, right? So, given the current economic situation, for example, like, how do you, like, I said this about the pandemic. Remember, I made a video about the pandemic 1 year ago when this thing was still, we were in April, so it was just, and I said that, right, it's, don't think that this is kind of an isolated thing, that, it's just a pandemic, right? Ever since this thing broke out, it was very clear to me that, we would have had to pay some costs, because we had essentially just to balance out, how much we cared about health and how much we cared about economy. But this was reasoning within just the pandemic in itself. On such a big factor occurring in the world, a world that is already very complicated on its own, that it was kind of obvious that it would have produced some greater difficulty in the system. After all, also von Clausewitz talks about this, when he talks about friction, for example. The fact, look at our logistics situation. I mean, it's worse today than it was at the beginning of the pandemic. Remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, they made a TV showing, the trucks that were still functioning. Yeah, everything's fine. Yeah, of course, it was fine at the time. It ain't fine now. With inflation, with a huge, and also with political mistakes regarding that, by the way, things are slowing down. We don't even realize what is going on. There are huge issues economically in the world right now that already also in a long-term process, and there are lots of things to fix. And so one can't say that now so many things will collapse, but objectively, when you start literally having some means that do not really arrive anymore and that are needed for you to work, and you have to shut down because you don't produce enough, and you really don't have many other ways to reverse the situation, etc. At this point, this thing will not go away, right? It won't like happen today and be forgotten tomorrow, right? This will trigger certain mechanisms that, again, by themselves are unpredictable. And this is the point, right? It's not matter you have to always think that will be a huge strategy, but as we were saying also in those videos about, history meeting science, etc., we are right at the point in which we have difficulties to maintain control in the complexity of this system. And that's why, and we also, this is mirrored by that kind of academic stagnation, and that has stopped even trying to understand the thing in a kind of a more comprehensive sense, right? And this is a topic for actually lots of other considerations, but we didn't talk much about the art of war in itself. You know what it is about, that we study the evolution of tactics, of armaments, the ways war was fought in itself. If we just had that, I presume we would have a much better understanding of the war. We would feel much more empowered. I would say that learning these things, more than else, gives you a sense of stability and of empowerment, and that most of what we're witnessing today in the world, things that do not go well, are not strange, kind of abstract things that depend on, let's say, on just the materials, all these things. It has to do with how we approach the thing. If we think we've just given up, we can't do anything, that's the reason why I talk on Schwerpunkt all the time. Because I think from my own standpoint, this thing at some point can reach more and more people, and therefore that we can be, and it can, of course, spread, that kind of confidence. Paradoxically, I do sound pessimistic. I don't think I'm a pessimistic person. I'm not an optimistic person here. There's no need to be any ism, right? Because that's a default position. It doesn't bear anyone. But it's showing the confidence in the possibility of fixing the problem that you help people regaining the initiative, and therefore the moral force is needed to make things work literally. Because that's the force that makes everything move. It's people, right? And that's what you should invest in, not some kind of odd mechanic, right? It's how we should cope with problems we have, etc. And therefore, we shouldn't buy into those people who say just, you're too sure of yourself. Yes, of course, you shouldn't never be too sure of thinking you know everything, and that's the default situation. But that's the paradox, that it's exactly in the moment in which you understand less that you have had the greatest acquisition of the need to understand more and to actually do it. If you instead just say, but it's strange, it's not, we can't say that, was not, we do need principles, we do need some standards, and it's counterintuitive, isn't it? And that's instead where where all the practice starts from, right? It's exactly from getting into the real world in terms of, just like the art of war, knowing what happened in real warfare, not in a kind of an abstract speculation of what warfare should be or is or isn't. That works, that makes the theory, that makes actually the positive application. For me, it's like magic. Like, I didn't know before studying the art of war that you can actually have such a huge positive application from studying it. You would think that it would create more problems than it does, right? And I remember this, that one of the best indicators of how well you know history is how confident it makes you, right? And this is kind of obvious in a sense, meaning that exactly those who start and do not have a clear understanding, they do tend to think, first of all, there is a huge understanding that is kind of good, and that should be the spring to say, okay, I should learn more. But the reason why they want to know more is exactly because they're not confident about that. They want to become confident. They want to know, to have always the answer for everything, and they want to have an opinion on everything. At the beginning, you really want, right? It will be kind of difficult, but it's exactly this cycle, this circle, this thing of trying over and over again that reinforces a more real understanding of the world, and because the world exposes itself to you, you go search for that information. You are provided with it. Warfare is a bit the same thing, right? I also talk myself in these videos about kind of an abstract understanding of warfare, but actually it's kind of concrete, right? For example, some weeks ago you asked me about I don't know, what was the Battle of Malplaquet, It's not that I ever studied in detail the Battle of Malplaquet, but I reread my things. It was a couple of sort of. I realized, of course, from studies that had, you know, we know what happened in Battle of Malplaquet right now, right? It may have, here it may surprise you, in fact, how respective to what I said before about medieval battles, right? But Malplaquet is, is also, we're talking about much better documented times, much larger battles. I mean, something that also was simpler in essence, because the largest and kind of the most evident things are, in a sense, and the least complex and complicated they can be. There are some doubts about certain things, but in general we know what it is. And it's not much that, it was easy to frame the strategical and tactical situation. Why? Because you've seen it so many times before. You understand what they were doing, who had the initiative, who didn't. What was an advantage, disadvantage, what was the plan, what was the objective, defining the objective. That's something we hardly, for not saying, not letting alone finding the Schwerpunkt, right? But even just having an idea of what's the objective of an army, we're not very well, habituated normally in history to explain why, for example, a war was fought. To us, it's they fought this war, because there were these causes, etc. But what did they want practically to do with that military operation? What was the objective of it? What is that immediately they wanted to do? Like, if you get that, it's much more, you acquire immediately, just by attitude, a much greater confidence in explaining what things are. And in this sense, military history clarifies a lot. Right? Because after all, again, as von Clausewitz himself says, after all, war is quite simple. Like, if you understand what happens there in the essentials, they're not overly complicated things at all. Right? Especially the most important they are, the simpler they are. This is just a necessity also of command, right? Of the art of war in itself. It's how to do it that is difficult. Right? And that shows you yet another dimension is, of course, how much force stood behind that effort, and so that makes you understand even much more conclusively what the objective was and why it was connected to that specific political, social reality. Knowing how to read a map, for example, well, it's crucial for strategy, because that's where the thing happens. You have to calculate it at that level. But again, it may not be so clear until you actually study it. So, as for there are some people who are kind of attracted to the idea of unknown as an alibi, right? While the unknown should be, colonized violently, imperialistically. That's the greatness of mankind, right? Instead, here the unknown is used as, I'm shy, I don't want to go out there because it's dangerous, and let's remain in the realm where I know the thing. Because that's where I know. In fact, that's kind of a almost paranoid behavior. It's like denying essentially the better self you could be, reaching beyond yourself, and being a better, definitely a more accomplished person for what? So that you can make gullible people who are just a step below you, that pretending that that unknown knows, because it can't really be told, right? There are things that can't be told, but it's not that they can't be told in just by default. Right? There are things that we can improve our understanding of, and exactly having seen so many things before sometimes helps you directly to even understand things without an explicit evidence. Right? How many times you would think historians work also a bit like that, that they should always provide you, of course, with any kind of possible evidence. Yes, as I was saying before, that's always what you should do. But at the same time, there's a judgmental process that if you haven't gotten through yourself all that data, as the person who kind of researched it, laid it out, and criticized them, and analyzed them, and came up with a conclusion, you can't quite see in the same way. That's why such efforts, like even like in fact instead trying to study a bit all the whole picture of warfare doesn't seem so appealing, because you say, it's going to take forever. Yeah, it's going to take forever. You won't leave enough to cover that at all. But at least you will have done something much more concrete that will have place a much heavier, compact stone on the, on the road than some kind of smaller path who's going to be, washed away by nature, because it's at the end of the day not really pretty sound, right? So these are my elucubrations, and then okay, I should have talked about Edgar, the Anglo-Saxon king, today, but I will do tomorrow, hopefully. Alright, but for today I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.